Deputy Presiding Officer, when 1 million fellow Scots voted to leave the European Union, we did so in the knowledge that powers currently held in Brussels would come back to the UK, and for the Scottish Parliament that would mean a host of powers coming here. For some of us that was an attractive proposition. For me it wasn't the main reason for voting to leave. That came down to a simple matter of democratic accountability, but it was an added bonus. And for many nationalists, those like Alex Neil, voting for Brexit was the only logical course to take if you really wanted this Parliament to have more controls over affairs in Scotland. Grumbling about powers being in Westminster but being over the moon about them being held in Brussels was and is simply illogical and hypocritical. The UK voted to leave the EU, and that's what's going to happen. It's incumbent on all parts of the UK to make sure that Brexit works. Now, mature politicians would sit down and do the deals that are necessary. Mature politicians do not stamp their feet, throw their toys out of the pram and scream, "I will never agree with you." But that's where we are now. We've had a staged walkout in the Commons, led by an appalling, boorish character, shamefully applauded by the First Minister. We've had vicious attacks on the Secretary of State for Scotland, who, whatever others may think of his politics, is a thoroughly decent man who does not deserve such insults. And we now have Mike Russell saying this Parliament won't give consent to any more Brexit-related legislation. Where does that leave the parliamentary scrutiny process?
Willie Rennie.
Much of what he has said, but does he acknowledge that the Conservative government have mismanaged this process from the very beginning? Does he have any regrets about any of that?
Graham Simpson.
I've got no regrets, but I do have some ideas which I'm coming to. All of this because the First Minister believes these tactics will fire up grievance among Scots. Well, she's making Mr Russell look stupid, and he isn't stupid, and she looks like the grudgemeister that she is. But worst of all, Scotland looks to the outside world like a childish nation of impudence, and we're not that. So what of this power grab? This Parliament isn't losing any powers. SNP members haven't been able to name any. It's gaining them, lots of them. And because we're part of the UK, then common frameworks are needed. There are just 24 areas where agreement needs to be reached. Sensible heads would be able to do that. Mr Russell would be able to do that. But when he's been harangued from Bute House, his hands are tied. There is no power grab. If there's a constitutional crisis, it's entirely of Nicola Sturgeon's making. Deputy Presiding Officer, last week I represented this Parliament at the latest meeting of the Interparliamentary Forum on Brexit. Unfortunately, Bruce Crawford could not be there as a counterbalance, as his flight never took off. But there is an appetite for cross-parliamentary working. We had a very interesting discussion with the Institute for Government on how devolution might work after Brexit. Of course, all governments of the UK have to want devolution to work. Sadly, this one does not, and the poor souls at the Institute for Government had rather overlooked that. The Forum previously recognised that the current system of intergovernment relations is not fit for purpose and is in urgent need of substantial reform. Last week we discussed the need for intergovernmental mechanisms for UK common frameworks and the importance of effective scrutiny of these processes. We discussed a number of ideas: an overhaul of the joint ministerial committee structures, formalising intergovernment relations mechanisms, the reformed JMCs being the forum for discussion and decision-making on common frameworks, decision-making structures for JMCs being clearly set out, and clear arrangements for parliamentary scrutiny of intergovernmental relations mechanisms being established and interparliamentary working being encouraged. Now, these are the kind of serious proposals we should be discussing, but we aren't. We're stuck in a trumped-up grievance Groundhog Day. It's time for the SNP to get on with the serious business of government. It's time for the SNP to grow up.